Well, let's now briefly speak about the challenges, the institutional arrangements, and the key debates in Australia's environmental policy. So you won't be surprised to know that one of the core challenges of Australia's environmental policy and even the world international policy on environment is around climate change. So, in the context of Australia, climate change really worsens things like the droughts. It gets to affect the bushfires, which have been with us quite recently. Extreme weather conditions in some areas. We recently had, the cyclone Alfred last year was it actually this year in Queensland? And other, things really which clearly are related to climate change. That makes climate change actually a top challenge and maybe a big priority in Australia's environmental policy. And we shall have a core module focusing particularly on climate change and climate action as we go in these lectures. The other one is around water scarcity. And again, this is not unique to Australia. If you go to other countries or other continents in Africa, technically this will be another challenge. But in Australia, water scarcity, is a core one, and you might want to see the core debates around that. Even if Australia is surrounded by water, being a kind of continent in its own makes water not that much accessible in some remote areas. And we might want to look at that as we go, and particularly in the reading we had for this week. Biodiversity loss is another core challenge, and technically there are more challenges. I'll probably add a Padlet here where you can add other challenges, maybe which you think people are facing in your community, and we might want to discuss about those in the tutorials. So, in terms of the institutional arrangements to responding to the different challenges, actually, there are again responsibilities of the federal government level. This includes things like leading the environmental policy, setting up national laws and even national priorities, and of course, funding major programs such as the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which gives mandate to the Australian government to intervene in that specific sector. Then there are responsibilities of the state and territory level, and that include things like managing the land, managing how water is being used and other resources, and of course, enforcing most environmental laws. And technically, the local government level also get to be involved when it comes to overseeing planning, waste management, and local conservation activities like planting trees. If you go for a citizenship ceremony, one of the things you might receive as a gift or whatever you might call it is a tree. It's because actually there is this assumption that we need to have trees, we need to plant many trees, and the government is really, really committed to that. And it's mostly taken at local government level. Other independent bodies get to be involved in terms of advising and monitoring environmental hazards, but also advocating for clear climate action and climate justice issues. There are many different agencies like the Clean Energy Regulator, Climate Change Authority, and many other examples, which you might again want to reflect on as you engage with this lecture material. So in terms of the trends, we have seen a lot of focus on integrating climate adaptation into all levels of policy, with a growing focus on renewable energy and reduction of emission. So if you are still struggling with some of these concepts, renewable energy, reduction of the emission, we shall talk about those in a minute, probably in the next few recordings. But technically, this has been one of the core focus over the last many years, that we now really need to start transitioning from renewable energy, not only in terms of how we produce power, but even in terms of transitioning from cars using fuel to cars, electrical cars. So there is a whole plan around that as to how we reduce emission and the environment pollution in particular. But also there is this public awareness and indigenous leadership, which are shaping new approaches. And indigenous knowledge is going to be very, very important in the way Australia keeps responding to core hazards such as the bushfire, and of course, even land management and many other environmental hazards, which we are prone to as a country. Now, in terms of the key debates, again, you'll see that many of these key debates are taken directly from the core reading from this week, the reading by Janet Stanley, which really recommended that you engage with. Australia's environmental policy is hotly debated. Key issues, of course, involve balancing economic growth with environment protection, fossil fuel transition, which is known as the non-emission policy, just mentioned, the transition to electrical vehicle, and there is a whole plan around that. And we can talk of, the international agenda around that specific plan. But also, we have to acknowledge that environmental policy is a core area where legislation actually has often lagged behind and failed to fully translate into effective action. Australia's environmental policy has been described as reactionary, reacting to specific hazards such as the bushfire, but not so much preventive. And there is a whole heap of political reasons we can discuss about. We can discuss which really are linked to the reason why Australia has not taken serious actions when it comes to, reducing, pollution or even climate change and planning for that and addressing that, even if it might be written somewhere in the written policies or in political discourse, we still have a long way to go when it comes to addressing these. Of course, there have been some advances with the current Albanese government, but previous government, technically, many of them didn't really take this seriously, and they had been characterized in a certain way that made Australia look like really not so much committed to some of its international commitments. So a few other debates in the reading you had would be around the market economy versus regulation. And the debate is over whether market mechanisms such as carbon pricing or approaches that are rather related to, regulatory activities would be more effective and fairer in how we get to address environmental hazards. This also engages, critics who argue that market-based solutions often fail to address redistributional justice and may neglect the needs of disadvantaged groups. And this, again, will be very important as we start discussing about, social justice and environmental justice in particular. But also, another core point on market economy versus regulation is how some people get to advocate for a program shift toward a need-based economy and degrowth models, which focus on really managing how we focus on economic growth to also focus at the same time on environmental growth. So there is this binary kind of construction around how we speak about environment, how we plan for it, and what kind of activity best response to, the environmental hazards we are currently facing as a nation. So the other debates are around climate change and how Australia, as I've just said, has been lagging behind. Actually, in the international literature and even in the text you read, the core text reading for this week, you'll see Australia being described as a climate laggard. And this is only describing again how Australia has actually been lagging behind in the global climate action movement. So despite high per capita emissions and being a major fossil fuel exporter, Australia's target to actually reduce emission are among the weakest in the global development, in the developed worlds. So this has been particularly observed in the decade which was characterized as the lost decade. That's the very recent decades where there had been governments in place, but which couldn't so much focus on, climate change and other climate hazards or other policy commitment in this specific sector. Again, that has been another core debate you'll find in the core reading for this week. So yeah, market economy versus regulation has been something we had already debated about, and you really might want to look at that in more details. Thank you so much, and see you in the next recording.